Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're joining us from, and a warm welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's event. My name is Daniel Shapiro. I'm a distinguished fellow in the Middle East programs at the Atlantic Council. And I'm delighted to introduce today's event on a very timely matter. The Biden administration has continuously, since it took office, expressed support for helping Israel achieve its qualification for the United States Visa Waiver Program. And Israel's efforts to join the Visa Waiver Program have been ongoing for many years and have faced along the way a number of political, legal, and practical hurdles in meeting the U.S. benchmarks for entry over those years. There's now a new Israeli government at the helm, and recently Ambassador Tom Nides announced the news that Israel's annual visa rejection rate had fallen below 3%, which is a requirement of the U.S. government to be able to enter the Visa Waiver Program. And the question now arises is whether 2023 can be the year that Israel meets all the other criteria and is able to finally join the Visa Waiver Program. So today's event is very timely and features a terrific lineup of speakers. I won't introduce them all because I'll let our moderator do that. But to start, and to frame the discussion, we're delighted to have with us the U.S. Deputy Chief of Mission to Israel from Embassy Jerusalem, Stephanie Hallett. She'll be followed by a panel of current and former U.S. officials and a leading Israeli journalist who will examine U.S.-Israel negotiations and assess the progress that made under the previous Israeli government and the next steps forward under the new government for Israel's admission into the program. The conversation that we're having today builds on a very timely and well-researched study issue brief from 2022, last year, that the Atlantic Council published. It was co-authored by Ruth Marks Eglish and Scott Lesensky. Scott is one of today's panelists in the second part of the program. It's called Fulfilling the Requirements, Israel's Entry into the U.S. Visa Waiver Program. And the link to that study will be available in the Zoom chat if you'd like to reference it. As a quick reminder, today's event is on the record and will be recorded. So we encourage all those who are watching to tweet and otherwise share today's content with your social media networks. So now it's a great pleasure for me to briefly introduce our first speaker. Stephanie Hallett is a career member of the Senior Foreign Service. Prior to her current role as the Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem, Stephanie has served as the acting senior director for the Middle East and North Africa and the director for Gulf Affairs at the National Security Council. She's previously served as the deputy chief of mission at two other embassies in Cyprus and in Oman. Her previous assignments include serving on the executive secretariat staff, as a political and economic section chief at the embassy in Bahrain, as a deputy political counselor at the embassy in Cairo. She's got broad regional, she's worked in the Office of Iranian Affairs in the State Department Operations Center and at the U.S. Consulates General in Monterrey, Mexico and Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. She's a graduate of the George Washington University and the University of Cambridge. So we're really blessed to have Stephanie come and provide the opening framing of this discussion. And Stephanie, I'm going to let you take this conversation wherever you want, but just to tell you what interesting to us as we get started is understanding from your perspective the benefit for the United States, as well as, of course, for Israeli foreign policy that would be achieved if Israel is able to qualify for admission to the Visa Waiver Program. We'd love to learn more about the role that Ambassador Nides and you and others in the office and the embassy have been playing to push this along and try to make progress toward Israel's qualification, and obviously what the role that you all will be playing in the next phase. But I'll turn this over to you to take in any direction you want. Stephanie Hallett, welcome, and we're delighted you're with us.
Thank you. Well, Ambassador Shapiro, appreciate the opportunity to come speak with you all. I just want to make sure you can hear me okay. Okay, great. Well, hello from Jerusalem to everybody joining us. Appreciate the question about the future of Israel's possible admission into the Visa Waiver Program. It is something that we are very much focused on here from the embassy and our colleagues in Washington as well. Look, from our perch in Israel, the embassy supports, of course, any steps in the bilateral relationship that would be beneficial for both US and Israeli citizens. And certainly one such step that we've been engaged in recently and has gotten more momentum is working together toward Israel fulfilling the requirements of the Visa Waiver Program that you referenced, Dan. Of course, as you all know, the Visa Waiver Program by design facilitates legitimate reciprocal travel, increases commerce, and certainly strengthens our people-to-people ties with countries that are members of this program. And of course, we would expect the same with Israel. Even more travel, more tourism, more economic activity, greater investment, trade, commerce into the United States over the nearly 140,000 Israelis who visited the US just in 2022. We'd expect those numbers to certainly grow with this program. But here I want to stress that in terms of our US core interests with Israel, the Visa Waiver Program is first and foremost a security partnership. So any country that is in the Visa Waiver Program is a beneficiary of the high standards, kind of aligning with global best practices to ensure that the program countries have the tools to make informed, consistent, and fact-based decisions at their borders. So meeting these high standards to get into the Visa Waiver Program will certainly enhance Israel's border management capabilities, and from our perspective, and I think Israel's perspective as well, make its security screening procedures that much more effective. Of course, while facilitating legitimate reciprocal travel, increasing commerce, and strengthening our people-to-people ties, as I referenced previously. So I just want to spend just a quick minute just underscoring what Visa Waiver Program is and isn't. Those of you who are familiar with the ESTA system, of course, the electronic system for travel authorization, know this very well. This tends to be confused here in Israel, I've noticed, but the Visa Waiver Program only covers the short-term stays of up to 90 days for tourism, business, or transit purposes. And so one thing we emphasize here publicly as well is that this is not about long-term stays, either in the United States or Israel, or travel for other purposes like long-term academic programs. For example, I always tell folks here that, as a diplomatic passport holder, I still need to get a visa to live and work in Israel at the US Embassy in Jerusalem, as will my Israeli counterparts, who will still need a diplomatic visa to work and live in Washington and other cities. So I think it's really important to underscore that, at least at this time, as you all know, Israel does not meet all of the Visa Waiver Program eligibility requirements. Certainly, to be eligible for the program, Israel still has significant work to do to complete on a very short timeline to meet all the program requirements to join the Visa Waiver Program this fiscal year, which of course, as you all know, ends on September 30th of 2023. So as you all will have seen, the big news last week, just as Secretary Blinken was arriving here on Monday, was that Israel has a visitor visa refusal rate below the 3% for fiscal year 2022, which ended September 30th, 2022, of course. So this is a first important step. And while it is an important step, it's just one requirement among many that all countries wishing to join the program must meet, Israel included, of course. Entry into the program, I think, as many of you know, is a complex and laborious process. Being below the 3% non-immigrant visa refusal rate is just one of the many steps to undertake to join the program. It's worth noting that this is not the first time Israel has had a visitor visa refusal rate below 3%. Israel was unable to fulfill the other requirements previously. And so this fiscal year, again, which we are almost halfway through, if the outcome is to be different this time, Israel has a lot of work to do in a very short amount of time. And this is what we here at the embassy, and certainly our colleagues in Washington at the Department of State and Department of Homeland Security, are working closely with the Israeli government to ensure that they fully understand the list of requirements. So what are those requirements? First, the Knesset is going to have to act pretty fast to pass 3 laws for Israel to qualify for the visa waiver program. They are making some progress on that, including even this week. Second, the Israeli government, across government ministries, is going to have to move quickly to set up the many technical requirements needed to become eligible for the visa waiver program. And so these are specific to data sharing and traveler screening, including information systems that have to be developed, then implemented and tested. And this is something I want to stress. It's not just a matter of developing the programs, they actually have to be implemented and tested this fiscal year. So the window for Israel to complete these actions and pass the required laws closes pretty quickly when you look at it. So again, this is something that we are technical experts are continuing to work with the Israeli government so they understand these technical requirements. And finally, I would say extending reciprocal privileges to each other's citizens and nationals is a fundamental requirement to enter this program. And this is something that you've maybe seen us talk quite a bit about publicly. So we expect equal treatment and freedom of travel for all US citizens and nationals, regardless of their national origin, religion, or ethnicity, who are seeking to enter or transit through Israel. So this is the same as the United States would grant such privileges to Israeli citizens traveling to the United States under the Visa Waiver Program. So what does this mean? It means that US passport holders are entitled to reciprocal short-term travel for tourism, business, and transit in the 40 other program countries that exist, regardless of their national origin, ethnicity, religion, race, gender, or sexual orientation. And what we've made clear is that we hold all Visa Waiver Program applicant countries to the same standard, and that's not going to be any different, of course, in this case for Israel. So I just want to say this again. Israel, and we've made this clear here in Jerusalem, Israel must commit to providing equal treatment and entry rights to US citizens and nationals, including Palestinian Americans and Arab Americans at Israel's borders and checkpoints, so that there's no differentiations in terms of how any American citizen is treated. Practically speaking, this means that Israel must commit to us, US government, that any person who has US citizenship and holds an American passport will be able to fly to Israel on short-term visits of up to 90 days, including travel to and out of the West Bank through Ben Gurion, and be treated exactly the same, no matter what their background is and no matter where they're going. So American regular or so-called tourist passports like this one are blue. And so what we've been saying here is when it comes to reciprocity for visa-free travel under the Visa Waiver Program, that blue is blue. Doesn't matter what the inside of my passport says, where I was born, but blue is blue. And that's something we've been emphasizing from Ambassador Nines on down to the Israeli government to make sure that is so clear. So what are we doing here from the US Embassy in Jerusalem to help? Well, very specifically, as I said at the top, we are helping Israel understand the scope of the significant work that needs to be completed on an expedited time frame in order to be considered for the Visa Waiver Program membership in this fiscal year. So all of us, again, including it's not just us at the embassy, but our colleagues in the Department of State and Department of Homeland Security in Washington, continue to engage closely on a regular, even sometimes daily basis with the government of Israel as it works to meet the requirements. And we're all here to help guide the Israeli government along the way to ensure they understand fully the requirements and very importantly, the associated timeframes for meeting the requirements. And so that's what we are doing, like I said, on an almost daily basis across the board with the Israeli government here. But I want to stress again that this is one of those things that only Israel can deliver. And truly, we hope they'll be able to do so. Certainly, Israel joining the Visa Waiver Program, as you all know, is really good for Israelis and Americans. It's really good for Israel generally and really good for the United States. And so we are putting tremendous effort behind this across the board and look forward to continuing to work with the Israeli government in the days and weeks and months through this fiscal year to come. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Stephanie, thank you so much for that very thorough explanation of the requirements and the process for Israel to join the Visa Waiver Program. We look forward to watching in the months ahead to see how this unfolds. Thank you for your service, and to you and your colleagues. And we'll let you go, and we'll move along to the next part of the program. So thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. Now that Stephanie has laid that framework for the discussion to come, I'm going to hand things over to the moderator of today's panel, Shalom Lipner. Shalom is a longtime member of the staff of the Prime Minister's office in Israel. We are fortunate that he is now a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council. And so, Shalom, I'm going to turn the rest of the program over to you.
Gotcha. I think we're good. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Stephanie, for getting us underway and framing our deeper dive into the nuances, the prospects, the ramifications, I would say, of Israel's bid to enter the Visa Waiver Program. I'm joined here today by 4 panelists, each of which has a unique vantage point on our topic. And introduce them briefly. Scott Lesensky is a senior advisor with Enter, the Jewish Peoplehood Alliance, and a lecturer at the University of Maryland. He was a senior policy advisor on Israel, the Middle East, and Jewish affairs during the Obama administration. Scott holds a PhD from Brandeis University and has co-authored 2 books on U.S. efforts to promote peace between Arabs and Israelis. Last October, he co-authored an Atlantic Council issue brief, which you've heard about, which surveyed the history and the future of Israel's quest to join the VWP. Robert Pascal is the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Affairs at the Department of Homeland Security, where his portfolio includes responsibility for counterterrorism, aviation security, and the Visa Waiver Program, among other things. He's also been the senior DHS representative in Europe. Bob served as a major in the Judge Advocate General's Corps of the U.S. Army. He holds a JD from New York Law School. Thanks, Bob, for being here. Tal Schneider is the political and diplomatic correspondent for the Times of Israel. She spent 5 years in Washington as a foreign correspondent for Ma'ariv, has published her own political blog, and has also covered national politics for the Globe's Financial Daily here in Israel. I'm sitting in Jerusalem. Tal is a media lawyer by training. And finally, batting cleanup, Tom Warwick is my colleague at the Atlantic Council, where he too is a non-resident senior fellow for Middle East programs. During the span of his long career in government service, Tom held a plethora of posts, including Deputy Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism Policy at DHS. He was Senior Advisor to the Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs and lead on the State Department's Future of Iraq project. He also somehow managed to work as an attorney in private practice for 17 years. Thank you all for being with us here today. We've got roughly an hour to have this conversation. The way I thought we'd structure this is I have a series of questions which I'll intersperse directed to each of you individually. Others are certainly invited to chime in on that. And I hope we'll keep some time toward the end of the conversation for Q&A from the audience. So let's jump in. Scott, in the report that you and Ruth Eglosh wrote, which, as everyone has said, is available on the Atlantic Council website and on the link in this Zoom chat, you explored the background of the Visa Waiver Program, which was created in the later half of the 1980s, and the circumstances, shall we say, of Israel's campaign to be accepted in the program. I think it would be useful if you could walk us through the technical side of the process and speak to the record of Israel's engagement with that process, and maybe also talk a little bit about the conclusions that you and Ruth reached from.
Thanks.
Sure.
You can hear me okay? I'll do the Stephanie Hallett sound check. Yeah. Let me take the second of those. I think it sounded like 3 questions. The second first. And in broad brush, try to take this 10-year 10 to 12 year odyssey of sorts, and highlight a few major issues, mostly that have delayed the process, but that have colored this this negotiation. And it's in fact it's a bilateral negotiation. Number one, there's been a cultural mismatch. We talk about it in the report. Ruth and I write about it. Whether it's top down in terms of Israeli and American negotiating behavior. And by the way, if anyone's interested, when I worked at the Institute of Peace in Washington, there's a tremendous series that Dick Solomon published. I think it's 10 or more books about different cultural habits in negotiations. There's definitely a big cultural mismatch in this long 10-year plus odyssey. First, you have Israeli officials at times looking for exceptions, and it's not unusual. There are exceptional cases in the bilateral relationship. You know, programs a lot of people don't know about, the National Guard program, big ticket things like offshore procurement in the defense relationship. It's not as if this bilateral relationship doesn't have some exceptional points, but I think it didn't sink in early on, and it's a shame because a lot of time was lost, that there aren't going to be carve-outs in this, which is, as was said earlier, is a security-driven program. And there's some other cultural issues as sort of broader Israeli cultural habits of sort of last-minute engagement and Americans taking a long view. There were other cultural mismatches in this, and you know, as a sort of outside observer, I'm no longer in government. It's a fascinating case study in a bilateral negotiation. There are Israeli social groups, the ultra-Orthodox, recently discharged army soldiers, and some cultural issues between how the embassy, I think, in earlier years, looked at some of their visa applications. So there's a whole range of sort of cultural issues. I put it all broadly under a cultural mismatch. There was a bit of an advocacy mismatch. I don't think there's a definitive history out there, but we reference in the study how some advocates for Israel at times were also seeking carve-outs, and that was a mismatch. There was a tremendous political mismatch. Donald Trump, the former president, and his administration seemed to have no interest in this. The very first thing I published, actually, on leaving the administration was an essay with Ambassador Shapiro about this issue and pointing to it as an important one on the bilateral relationship, on the people-to-people side. But you know, the 4 years of the Trump administration, in my view, as an outsider, looked like a nothing burger. We'll call it a vegetarian, in my case, nothing burger. But you know, 4 years of really nothing on this issue, and you know that's kind of where we get to this current point. And this current point is totally different, I think, from everything we've seen in the last 12 years. You have a President Biden, who spoke about it in a bilateral meeting with former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett. You have an American team that seems to be very aligned and focused. That high visibility on the Israeli side makes a big difference. They're looking to, quote, fulfill the requirements. That seems to be the sole approach. And I've even seen, just in the few years I've talked to Israeli officials about it, since I've been out of government, they no longer bring up questions of exceptions and exemptions and carve-outs. So, you know, I think the stars are aligned in some way, but there's still a lot of things to get done. The one thing I'll sort of add to Stephanie's, as she gave, and first of all, that was a tremendous piece. I think Robert will add a lot more after. I hope that every Israeli official and everyone in their office and everyone who's an intern in those offices listens to Stephanie's presentation at the beginning, because it's more than you've heard, even though we heard a lot from Ambassador Nides, a lot from DHS, a lot from the embassy in their release last Monday. That was a very important statement, and I think Robert will add to that. With the visa refusal rate now passed as of last Monday, the important thing, I think in these 6 months, maybe Stephanie, I don't know if she would agree, it's kind of a sprint to the finish line if they get there, is that every measure is under the control of the Israeli government. It's no longer dependent on, you know, this visa applicant from the Galilee or the Negev. This is solely in their control in the months ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll take it back from you. And segue best, you know, on the back end of your question, Bob. Just before the Secretary's visit, as everyone said, you know, it was the announcement of the fact that Israel had met the 3% refusal rate. Could you actually elaborate a little further on those sort of remaining legislative and technological challenges we're talking about here? And I would also add, because you know I discussed this before, maybe you could elaborate a little bit on why, from your perspective, in any event, this is, you know, that Israel's ascension to the program would be beneficial for both the United States and for Israel.
Happy to do so. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm looking forward to the discussion, and so far, I really enjoyed listening to Stephanie and all the comments. First of all, the Visa Waiver Program is one of my favorite things we do at the Department of Homeland Security, and it's one of the best things we do. It facilitates legitimate travel, but allows for security. And as was mentioned before, it's first and foremost a security partnership between the United States and participating countries. The VWP enhances the security of our citizens, strengthens people-to-people ties by facilitating legitimate reciprocal travel, and increases commerce. But it also increases the security of the countries we're dealing with, because it raises their bar on their security and also provides additional tools that allow for security to be enhanced. DHS designated Poland into the program in 2019 and Croatia in 2021. So we know the process and we know how to achieve designation. And in both cases, we did so in a relatively short period of time, which gives me optimism that we can get Israel in on this expedited timeline. As was mentioned, Israel at this time does not meet all of the VWP requirements. Israel still has significant work to do to repeat on a very short timeline, and September 30th, 2023 is our hard and fast deadline. I think people have mentioned this before, but it's important to note that these deadlines, for the most part, are statutory. Congress has set them out in the Visa Waiver Program. We have no discretion on these deadlines or these requirements. We can't negotiate. We can't make an exception. We need to make sure that they fulfill every one of these requirements. And was mentioned previously, we're not hiding the ball. We've given them not just the test, but the answer key. So from the perspective of, if they meet all the things on our work plan, they're going to be in. So it's up to the Israeli government to do the work. As mentioned, Israel's timely passage of the related legislation for information sharing with the U.S. and traveler screening is an essential step. The legislation enhances Israel's ability to prevent, detect, and combat serious crime and terrorism, and will bring Israel in line with the international standards related to traveler screening, such as UN Security Council 2396 and the International Civil Aviation Organization Annex 9 Standard and Practices. These are both information sharing requirements that are really vital to how we run the ESTA program and how we run the Visa Waiver Program. So those are being worked on. But as Stephanie mentioned, the trick is that we don't just have to get those connected. We have to test them. We have to make sure they work. And I'm sure anyone who's ever worked in an IT project, they are tricky. They're difficult to make that working. So we are committed to working with Israel to work that. U.S. tourist passport holders are entitled to reciprocal travel under the Visa Waiver Program in 40 other program countries, regardless of national origin, ethnicity, religion, race, gender, or sexual orientation, and will hold Israel and any other country that comes into the program to the same standard. As was mentioned, we really like the framing that Stephanie and Ambassador Nines has given, is that blue is blue for the passports. So I don't have anything to add in addition to Stephanie's remarks on reciprocity, but our tagline is blue is blue. So the question was, well, how will this increase Israel's security? So we do a lot of work on with data on ensuring we know who's coming into the country and ensuring that those people are checked against our some of our databases, and that will allow Israel to also do that as well. So it's a reciprocal agreement, and it enhances safety. Other things that we do, and all the requirements of the Visa Waiver Program are on the website, just allow for bilateral cooperation and ensuring that we keep the bad people out and we let the good people get in, and we let them get in on a quicker basis. I hope that answered the question.
One second. Yes, thanks. Great. Well, am I still muted? No, I'm not muted. Over to Tal. We've heard this basically from everybody who's spoken so far. Now the ball's in Israel's court, I think we can say. It was pretty widely reported during the term of the last Israeli government that the then opposition leader was approached by the U.S. ambassador to try and, to solicit his cooperation advancing legislation, but that didn't go anywhere, or went nowhere fast. And as everybody said, political tables have turned since then. How do you expect this coalition to perform I think it wouldn't be fair to say that not all members of the coalition are as enthusiastic about this as some of the others. Maybe you'd seen over the weekend, Gil Bringer, who's in charge of the project here, number 2 at the Immigration Population Registry, talked about that the deadlines require that the legislative piece of this, this package has to pass within the end of this session in the next 2 months, or they'll never be able to meet the deadlines. Is it realistic? I mean, is the Israeli bureaucracy up to that task?
Yes, hi. So first of all, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here among friends. Yeah, you are absolutely right. The legislation passed the first call in the last Knesset, the former coalition when Yair Lapid was the prime minister and Gideon Sa'ar was the justice minister. They already passed it through the first phase, and the opposition at the time, led by the Likud and Netanyahu, said we're not going to vote for anything of such. And when when me reporters asked them, why wouldn't you collaborate? It's for the benefit of the entire people of Israel. They said the bill is complicated and it means entering into people's private, security issues. I mean, the database, it can infringe, personal rights and so on. And this is the reason they gave for not promoting the bill, because obviously, as political correspondent, political reporter, we all know the real reason was that they did not want to give the other side, Bennett, Lapid, and Justice Minister Sa'ar, they didn't want to give them the advantage of promoting such an important bill as a huge achievement. That was the real reason. But what they said is that they are concerned for private rights of under database and so on. Obviously, when governments changed and the new government is in power, all they need to do is take that bill that already passed the first round of votes and just put it through a committee, a specific committee, and then into the Knesset for the second and third rounds. That can be done pretty, fast if they want to. My understanding and the way I know Israeli politics for so many years, you are not going to hear anything more about the concerns the Likud had back in the summer with respect to infringing people's rights or people rights under the database. We're not going to hear that anymore. I think the concerns are off the table once they're in power, and they're gonna run through they can run for the legislation pretty fast. My understanding is that they didn't start it yet. The Knesset is pretty backlogged with the judicial changes, judicial's overhaul they are promoting. So, for example, one of the committees that is supposed to delve into that bill, take it, as I said, after the first round and put it through the second and the third rounds. This is the Judicial Committee. It is now dealing with government's power to appoint judges and so on. So it could be done, but it's, as I said, it's backlogged. They need to change priorities. Also, I want to mention that, achieving that bill and achieving the process altogether under the deadline, as was explained before me, dealing with the legislation in 2 months and then dealing with the system and with the deadline until the end of September 23. I think whoever will do it, this is the government, will benefit from a huge public how to say that, a huge public
appreciation.
And it's a huge win. I mean, this is something that is in any way, if you look at the Israelis or Palestinians or American Palestinians, they want to come to Israel, from all point of view, this is something that is in a consensus. Everybody here wants it for so many years. So whoever will get this done will get probably the Israeli Nobel Prize for something, like our own, it's a big prize. So once this government is doing this, I mean, they know it for sure, Netanyahu, it's a very, very popular move under any kind of process. So even with the infringement of rights or whatever, the reason for the objection was, any government knows that. Everyone will try to get the credit. People who were interior minister many years ago, or people who are interior minister at the moment. Actually, we don't have an interior minister at the moment, but Ayelet Shaked and the security operation, everybody will take credit. The prime minister will probably take credit. The opposition leaders will take credit. So, I would say that if you ask a person here on the streets, there is an anticipation for that. People really want that program to be, put through the entire process and be achieved.
Can I
Thanks
just
so much.
interject quickly, Shalom? You
Yeah,
allowed
please.
us to pipe in.
I did, Scott.
I just want to reinforce what Tal just said. It's a case study in responsive politics. So the Knesset needs to respond to the public. Other stakeholder communities that have a huge, a lot of equities on the table here, Arab Americans, Palestinian Americans, especially the Jewish American community in its huge array of cultural and exchange and people-to-people programs, don't necessarily have like a sort of direct line, and there's a lot of deference and lobbying, but this has huge public implications. And I could say, and I should have said earlier, the day I got to Israel as an American diplomat, I fully appreciate it. This was off my agenda. It's literally the first thing most Israelis want to talk to you about. And again, as Tal just said, this has tremendous consensus support around Israeli society. The question is, can the government align what it needs to do to get done to meet the requirements?
Well, I guess ironically, under these circumstances too, it's going to be one of the few things that both sides of the aisle can agree on, because there aren't too many things they agree with right now.
Win-win for everyone.
Right. Tom, we're talking about the politics already. You've seen this cloud from both sides now, right? Inside government and out. Israelis have wondered for a long time. Some might say they've been insulted that the United States' closest ally would not grant them access to the program all these years. Those discussions have been going for a long time. To what extent do the political tides have an impact on the progress of this? Is this process completely isolated from that? Are we being naive about it? And there are people out there that are saying, we do want to hand this prize to, tell us that we want to hand this prize to one government, not to another government. What other influences on this, if at all, come to bear beyond the technical and the legislative and the things that we've talked about?
So from the United States perspective, and I'm speaking obviously now as a former US government official, the entire process of travel between countries is one that is the subject of hundreds of years of diplomatic experience. Countries issue passports to identify their citizens, in theory, to foreign sovereigns. If you ever read the document, your passport says, please facilitate the travel of my citizen. And countries, on the other hand, have the right to issue visas to decide who will be allowed into their country. As international travel became something that everyone could enjoy and benefit from socially, politically, and economically, governments then tried to figure out ways of making travel more efficient. And so the Visa Waiver Program is something that the United States set up so that citizens of our closest allies don't have to go to an American embassy or consulate, wait in line, pay the expense, disrupt their lives by having to travel before they can travel to the United States. The Visa Waiver Program includes 40 countries from New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, and Australia in the Pacific, through many of the countries of Europe and countries in the Western Hemisphere like Chile. And the Visa Waiver Program, as Bob says, is a statutory program. It's not one that officials at the Department of State or the Department of Homeland Security get to make up the rules as they go along. Congress very carefully negotiated what the requirements were when it enacted the Visa Waiver Program, and it subsequently modified those conditions during the Obama administration. And so what Israeli citizens would like to benefit from is avoiding the time and expense of getting a visa before they have to travel. And so this is why these requirements that Stephanie and others have spoken to are locked into place. They're not the subject of political negotiations because the United States is not able to open up the program to political discussions in every other candidate country. What we're left with is something that is the product of a number of security considerations. And as Bob said, the information sharing that the Visa Waiver Program will create flows both ways. One of the key requirements is that information needs to be exchanged so that anytime someone from a Visa Waiver Program country wants to travel to the United States, U.S. security agencies like the State Department and the Department of Homeland Security can check to see if that person has a criminal record or has a history of support for terrorism. Countries, including Israel, but also the United States, always retain the right to decide on an individual basis who can come into their countries. What the United States requires is that, apart from individualized concerns, everyone who carries a U.S. passport should be treated equally, regardless of their background, their ethnicity, or their religion, or sexual orientation. These are core values for Americans, and something that we expect all of the Visa Waiver Program countries to live up to. Israel is going to need to fulfill the requirements, just as 40 other countries have, and I think the result will be facilitated easier travel for Israelis, regardless of their background, because we must also bear in mind Israel is a diverse society as well. But it will benefit Israelis when they wish to come to the United States, and it will also benefit Americans when they wish to travel to Israel and the surrounding areas.
Thank you, Tom. Back to Scott, coming around the horn a second time. You alluded, you mentioned, the idea before, certainly, Jewish communities in the United States, the Arab communities in the United States, Congress. I mean, we're talking now about how the administration's hands per se are tied, shall we say, as far as how this program operates itself. That it's not open to these kinds of these other calculations. But like in the course of your research into this field in general, what have you seen coming out of there? I mean, clearly, people have
it's a great question, really great question. I'm not an expert on statutory matters and on the technical side. The statutory piece, the legal piece, I've read the bill a number of times. We cited in the study, is relatively I don't want to say vague, but the reciprocal privileges, the language is a lot easier to interpret. I'm going to speak carefully here. I hope Robert and Tom and the others would agree with me. It's a lot easier to interpret for every other country that's already in the program. Israel's occupation of the West Bank and all the equities related to Palestinians is a rather unique element to Israel's application. And the application of the statutory requirement on reciprocal privileges, on equal treatment, on that core mantra, blue is blue. You'll hear it again in Tom Nides in the video. It was in the two statements last Monday. It was said here today. It's important to keep repeating that principle. There are clearly some complexities in how it's implemented. And that's probably the kinds of things that I imagine Robert is working on. I'm not going to discuss maybe here in this kind of a forum in great detail. But that is an added complexity. The other thing I would say is when I mentioned the cultural mismatch before and the advocacy mismatch and the big political mismatch under Trump, I should have mentioned there is a blind spot. You've got a community in the United States, the American Jewish community, that's deeply invested in cultural and exchange ties. President Biden spoke at the Maccabiah in Jerusalem. It was like a big deal at this kind of Jewish Olympics. But when some of those young athletes wanted to come to America for a companion event a few weeks later, couldn't get their visas, couldn't make it. But it's not really on the radar of at the top tier. I talk it up often, but I'm surprised how many Jewish American leaders aren't familiar with it. And I believe it's because there's a blind spot. Americans, particularly those who travel frequently to Israel, get a visa automatically on site at the airport. The whole process that Israelis have to go through, the time, the money, the rejections, the added difficulties during the pandemic are something that really, oddly, are not felt and understood by the one affinity group here in the United States, Jewish Americans, that you think would be advocating and raising a lot of awareness about that. So I hope through this event, through the Atlantic Council study, I think also through President Biden's mentioning of this and his administration kind of raising the profile, it's suddenly on everyone's agenda. And I hope, again, after this event today, and particularly the earlier comments, the understanding that it's a win-win. Getting different, the last thing I'll say to your question, Shalom, is sort of getting some of the stakeholder communities out of their, I think, misinformed perceptions that somehow there's a zero-sum degree to this. Oh, Israel will have to give up some piece of their security or change some core practice related to Arab American or Palestinian American visitors, or some other zero-sum calculation. It really is a win-win. It takes a lot of effort. It's not a freebie. It's a lot of effort on the technical side, on administrative side. And there are probably costs that the Israeli government will have to bear, but it is truly a win-win. It's not going to end the occupation. It's not going to bring a two-state solution around the corner, but it's a huge, huge win on the people-to-people side.
Bob, what happens if they don't cross the bar? Clock resets, goes back to the beginning. What does that look like? I mean, from the banter that I'm hearing, people are saying, this is sort of a, this is the shot. This is the moonshot. It goes through now. It doesn't happen now. It doesn't happen at all. I think what my understanding is the difference, if not all the pieces are in place by the end of fiscal year, by the end of September or something, right, then clock gets reset, the refusal count has to start all over again, et cetera, et cetera. What does that process even look like? Are people even, nobody here seems, none of us want that to happen while working for this to get over the finish line. But I'm just like, what happens in that kind of scenario if you end up there? Like, second chance, not second chance, what does that look like?
Sure. So with the Visa Waiver Program, it's a Department of Homeland Security program that we run, but we have a tremendous amount of input from the Department of State. And one of the areas that we get input in and requirements from for state is the NIV rate. So the NIV rate, non-immigrant visa rate, which if you've ever looked at is a complex number. And since you use the term moonshot, I will say it's like launching a missile. The calculations are extremely difficult. So that will have to be recalculated. And from what I understand, the embassy has taken extraordinary efforts to get to work with the Israeli government to get the number down below. There's no guarantee it will be below 3%. In fact, a lot of times we see bounces when they get below 3% because of just a lot of work that the embassy is focused on. So from our perspective, I would really say we need to focus on the next 10 months and get this done as soon as possible, 9 months. So they would have to be recalculated. As you noticed, the numbers didn't come out until just a couple of weeks ago. So there's always a lag. So we won't know what the new numbers are until the end of January, maybe the beginning of February. So it is very important to focus on what we can do now and try and work with Israel and get them into the program now. I do want to mention two things that Scott mentioned about some of the individual challenges that Israel has. So every country has some specific issues. Israel has a lot of them, but a lot of the countries we've looked at, there have been issues that we've worked through, and that all of these are not the easiest thing in the world, but a lot of times there are issues that we work with the country. So we're working with Israel on the issues and getting them through. The second point is that when there is a designation in the Visa Waiver Program. That's not the end. We consider that just the beginning. There is additional reviews we do every 2 years that are also statutorily required, that we have to go in and check and make sure that Israel is in compliance with the program, and that we do this all the time with our 40 countries. We have a staff that works through it, and that's basically their work is to go through the entire process every 2 years and make sure that the countries are in compliance. Because as was mentioned, this is a security program. And just as we evolve through our issues.
Did we lose Bob?
I think we lost Bob for a moment. I'm sure he'll log back on.
Tom, you want to pick up where he was?
Let's ask the question again so that everyone's reminded what it is.
And I was talking about what would the scenario look like in the case where, Israel didn't make the grade this time and we have to go through it again.
Right. So the requirements in the statute include something that changes every year. Israel's visa refusal rate, which to take the calculus out of the equation, is basically the number of applicants for visas, and then you divide into that the number that are actually granted visas under US law. That number has hovered so that the refusal rate is above 3% most years in the past. It's taken a very significant public education effort by the Israeli government, working with the embassy, and some actual, serious hands-on leadership by Ambassador Shapiro and other U.S. diplomats and officials to try to get that number down. There's no certainty that Israel would meet the standard in another year. Let's all take advantage of the opportunity that it has met it this past year. Then the other question is, why would Israel not want to fulfill the technical requirements on things like computerized sharing of criminal record information and the reciprocity requirements? If Israel, a sovereign government, decides that it does not want to meet those requirements, then unless something changes in Israel, it's hard to see that Israel would ever be eligible for the Visa Waiver Program. That's a situation that I think no one wants, certainly not the US government, certainly not the American people, not the Israeli people. And so I really do think that now is the time to try to get all of the stars to align and to meet all of the requirements. And that's why I think there's such a strong push to get this done this year. In previous years, there have been other issues on the table between the US and Israeli governments. Those sometimes become all-consuming. But I really do think that this is a year where things should fall into place, provided Israel can fulfill the last of the requirements.
Let me follow. The truth is, I was going to ask you something later. I'll ask it now since we're having this conversation. First, one other question I was going to ask Bob as well. He was talking about the review, the periodic review that come. In other words, this isn't the end of the process. Are there precedents for countries that have fallen out of the program that you know of?
I have to say the answer
Argentina.
is the answer is yes. And these are among some of the most painful discussions that I was involved in when I was at the Department of Homeland Security. No one wants to see a country drop out of the Visa Waiver Program because it is in many respects one of the most important security partnerships that the US government has. And as a former security official in the US government, I always hate to think of the prospect of an ally falling backwards in terms of its security cooperation with the United States. So yes, it's possible. It's happened. We really hope it never happens again.
Just to bring Bob up to speed, I had asked Tom, because you disappeared, if there were precedent for countries that have fallen out of the program, and he kindly stepped in. The other question I was going to ask, and I'll ask it to both of you, and again, all these questions are open to all of you, beyond which I will again remind people that they can post questions in the Q&A on the site, and we'll start taking some of those as well. We were talking about the reciprocity, the reciprocity piece now, among other things. The issue of counterterror is obviously important to both countries. I mean, you've seen it both up close on the policy side, not just the theoretical side. And it's been conventional wisdom that would be one of the major stumbling blocks in terms of how Israel will be able to approach this kind of thing. I remember seeing at one point anyway that a former head of Shin Bet, I think Nadav Argaman, was quoted as saying at one point, that's not a big deal. I can hit that out of the park. I think that the sense is that there are solutions to that. Clearly, neither of the governments wants to go into a program where either one of them is exposed on that issue as a result of that. Can you talk for a second about what that looks like? In other words, we know what the concerns would be, but what kind of, more specifically, the extent that we can talk about it publicly, what kind of safeguards should we say are in place? How does this actually improve the security of this? and not only not create a problem, but make it beneficial for both sides to sign on to this, because it will actually improve their counter-terror posture as opposed to presenting a liability. Either one of you.
All right. Well, I'll go first while Bob reaches for his mute button.
Right.
Look, Israel faces a terrorism threat like no other country on earth. And the United States takes very seriously the terrorist threats to Israel as much as it takes seriously terrorist threats against the United States. That's the close nature of the US Israeli security partnership on counterterrorism. It is certainly true also that every country, Israel, the United States, or any other country, retains a sovereign right to decide individually whether to deny someone entry to the United States. But one of the greatest challenges in counterterrorism work is always figuring out how to spend more time on the people who are a security concern by spending less time on the people who are not. And one of the values of the Visa Waiver Program is exactly that. It allows US officials to focus more time and attention trying to understand people who do pose a security concern by saying that the vast majority of travelers coming from these countries are not a security concern. Some of the basic processes, like the ability of computers on the US side to submit to Israel, here are a list of people from your country who have said they want to come to the United States. Who of these people has a criminal record that we need to say you need to go get a visa? Because one of the things that most people don't remember is even if you are denied under the ESTA, the Electronic System for Travel Authorization, to be able to come to the United States without a visa, you can always go into a US embassy or consulate and apply for a visa. So these kinds of things are not an absolute refusal. It just requires an additional security check before a US official is convinced that travel is authorized and legitimate and valid under US law. So these kinds of processes will allow the United States to make better decisions about who is and is not a risk. And similarly, Israel's ability to ask the same question of US databases when people wish to come to Israel is one that should enhance the security posture of both countries. So while we recognize Israel takes extraordinary measures to ensure the security of its airports, the United States has far many more airports and has procedures that have worked well for us. But the Visa Waiver Program and all the other associated data sharing programs that are involved really should help security for both sides. So now, Bob, over to you if I've missed anything.
No, not at all, Tom. A couple of points that I would mention, though, is first and foremost, we at DHS, the U.S. government, State Department, we don't want to compromise Israeli security in any way. If Israel has a legitimate reason for denying someone entry, that's their, as you mentioned, that's their right as a sovereign country. They get to determine security for their country, and we would not presuppose to say, to want to get involved in that or to get involved in the decisions for the security of what they do. So that's really important. VWP strengthens the partnership with Israel, and that closer collaboration to extends to all areas, including counterterrorism. Information sharing and overall security strengthening are two of the pillars of the Visa Waiver Program, so that it is a reciprocal program. We will strengthen each other's systems. We will be able to provide information, and information sharing in this new era is the silver bullet. It really is a key on how we make sure that we know what the threat is before it lands. I think you want to make sure that you don't have a threat that lands at JFK. You want to know 3 days before the person gets on the plane, and that's what the information sharing does, and also allows us to get in the processes earlier and work with our country and our partners in the Visa Waiver Program earlier to ensure that we have a more secure travel system.
Al, if we're talking about the technical side of this again now, last week I heard Tomer Latan on the radio. Tomer is the former Director General of the Public Security Ministry. He was talking about this process, and I heard him say that, as a result of the election and then the transition, that, the government lost precious time to budget and to plan for these systems to get them up and running. In your view on the technological side, like not the political piece about whether or not the Knesset can get its work done on time on this thing, what does that look like? Are you privy to any of that information on that sort of piece on what's involved in getting that system up and running? Is the money been allocated to that? Are the pieces in place? I think in his words, it was sort of like, it's definitely not a given that Israel could actually meet the deadline on the technological side. Do you have any sense if that's, how accurate that might be?
It's going to take a lot of work, and it's going to take a lot of combined concerted effort on the Israeli government. We think it's doable. We do think it's doable within the timeline. We're very heartened to see that one of the things that has happened that's helped a lot in the last two efforts to get countries into the program is they having what we've called a champion. That someone is the single point of contact and can get things done within the government. We had one in Poland. We had a wonderful one in Croatia. They now have one in Israel, and can go cut across all parts of the government who is empowered. That's the kind of work you need. That's the kind of person that can say, what are your problems? How do we solve this? Why didn't we fix this? Why didn't this get done? So that person's in place, and we're very heartened by that. It's going to be a challenge, but things worth doing usually are. We think that the Israelis government can do it, and we're hopeful, and we stand ready to help in any way. I have one person who is actually embedded in the embassy, who's working full time on this with the Israeli government. I think Stephanie mentioned that we're in daily contact. We are definitely in daily contact. She's doing a tremendous job making sure that the Israelis have no hiccup from us, and that any of the information that they need to get, they get from us right away.
Al, you want to jump on that too, maybe? Al, on the technical side of this, is the system ready to get up and get this job done in time? Is it, maybe wishful thinking? Not?
Let me just say that let's hope Israel's abilities to promote those issues is not dependent on the ministers, because in Israel's ministers are not in place for so long. We don't have an interior minister at the moment, and the Homeland Security Minister is Itamar Ben-Gvir. He's very busy with other things. He likes to be on the ground elsewhere, and is not really into doing office work. But in Israel, the system is very different from the American system. There is a high level of civil servants, professional servants work in the offices, and they're not being replaced under a new government. So hopefully those people who are in power, the civil servants' power and authorities, they are the real one who are doing the work, and we can count on them in Israel to be professional and fast forward moving with the process. The reason we don't have an interior minister at the moment is because Aryeh Deri was the interior minister until 10 days ago, but Israel Supreme Court said that he can no longer serve on that job, and Netanyahu did not appoint a new one as we speak.
Of course, it also seems that he seems to be working out of his house these days, so I'm not so sure how much of a problem that is or isn't.
But as I said, I think it's not. It's more to the people in the Interior Ministry that has been in place for many years and are not replaced once there is a new minister in power. So thanks for that. Until at least now, they will promote this and not him.
And if I could just add in, and that's entirely true, because the work's going to be done. However, by the civil servants, the political leadership and the direction to do it is phenomenally important. That is now in place. That that they have from the highest levels, they're being directed to do what they need to do, go and spend the money, make sure that gets done, so that the civil servants now understand the importance of getting this done in a short period of time.
Shalom, you're on mute.
Thank you, Tom. Good call. I was just looking at the Q&A questions here, a couple of technical throw. I have one question. Someone saying Stephanie had mentioned the travel through Ben Gurion, right? And Tom, of course, mentioned multiple points of entry in the United States. Presumably, the stuff we're talking involves Allenby as well. Are we talking about all the crossings in the conversation, or is there sort of a differentiation between different entry points in Israel in terms of this program?
We are still in discussions with Israel.
So it's not a given at this point, per se.
It's still being discussed.
Okay. Also, we're taking questions here. Somebody's asking about when we're looking at the which individuals living in territory are considered when calculating the rate. I guess maybe this involves a refusal rate. Who's counted in that? Is that would be, I assume, all the applications that went through the embassies, the embassy Jerusalem/Tel Aviv, or is there a subsection of that when we're looking at applications?
I'm gonna have to defer that to State Department question, and much as I barely understand our technical requirements, I don't want to go into state's technical requirements.
Fair enough. More things here? Check that out.
I don't know if Stephanie is with us, Shalom, but essentially,
I doubt it.
Yeah, essentially, it's the number of visas that are granted divided by the number of applications for visas. Now, that having been said, there are some important subtle elements. For example, one of the problems had been that people in the consular section in the U.S. Embassy in Israel were denying visas to whole categories of people based on a perception that people in that category overstayed their visas. Most visas, and in fact, all visas under the Visa Waiver Program, are only good for 90 days. In other words, you can stay in the United States 90 days, and then you're required to leave. You could then reapply if you want. But when the U.S. Embassy was denying visas for whole categories of people, this drove the refusal rate well over 3%. And so there needed to be a strong and systematic campaign supported by the government of Israel and by the U.S. Embassy there to educate people and to get them to understand that, no, you really do have to come back to Israel when your time in the United States has expired under U.S. law. And so that's why these rates are complicated, and they're sometimes difficult to meet. And Israel, as we said, has an opportunity because this year it achieved a refusal rate less than 3%, which is what the statute requires in the United States. So this really is the year that Israel really should push forward on all of these other technical requirements so that it can be admitted to the program.
Hal, something Tom said triggered in my head a niche conversation that's been happening in Israel here. I wonder what you have to say about it. You probably picked up on this as well a couple of weeks back or something. Prime Minister made some statement about how this would be a boon for Aliyah, for immigration to Israel, the Visa Waiver Program. Not that presumably it had something to do with other people who were concerned that maybe it would be so Tom was talking, presumably some people interpret it as a way for people to actually get up and move to the United States, which of course this program is not about. I'm wondering like where that whole thread came from. And I would even tie it into a larger question of, we had this conversation earlier, all of us, about, that this is something that's very popular in Israel. And I alluded to this earlier when I talked about sort of different forces in the current coalition. Well, I'm wondering how true that might necessarily be. I've been developing this sort of theory in my head in recent months, talking about leverage and priorities and, what might be important to this government and might not be important to this government. And I'm wondering, if the goals here are, maybe to encourage business or tourism or something, whether that is something that, is necessarily important to all the members of this coalition, or to other people have much more parochial concerns and, they're things they want to see happen first. And I think we even saw there were reports that maybe, I remember I picked up, but I believe there were some members of Veto faction who said also they wanted to revisit the reciprocity issue because they thought that it was exposing Israel to danger. All kinds of red flags that we've seen people that might conceivably put up because this is such a big deal to them. They have other priorities. and whether or not, that could actually put spokes in the wheel, or what's going on in terms of the perception of the program today in the country? Do you still think that it's widely seen as a prize across the board, or are we, looking at sort of, especially now the country seems so divided on so many lines, maybe, not everybody perceives it that way, and this could, conceivably fall victim to that division as well, or is that, too far-fetched?
That question is to me?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm not sure I really understood the first part of your question, but I can tell you that it is a prize across the board.
Okay.
As you have seen in recent weeks with the demonstrations and a lot of criticism that is coming on Israel's government, you do see the importance of the high-tech industry in Israel. People maybe don't know that, but you have like 10% of Israel's worker force work in tech companies, 10% of Israel's workforce. But when you look on Israel's budget and income from taxes, the tech force pays 25% of Israel's taxes income. That's a huge gap. So 10% of the workers here are paying 25% of the budget. How do they do it? They do it from traveling to the EU and from traveling to the United States. These are business people, executive, just software engineers, and purchasers of software and marketing executive. This is not just the big executive on the top of the companies. This is just, we live here. I have friends in the tech industries. They are, all of us, around age of 50 or something, traveling back and forth to the United States every other month. This is like the Israeli way of life. They are doing this, they're doing business. It's a very huge component of Israel's economy. So if you are implying that maybe the finance minister who is coming from the settlement, or maybe he was not fully aware to the importance of the tech industry, you can be sure that these days with the big demonstrations, he knows all the details. Everybody knows the details. The tech executive, the tech companies are, basis, a big basis of the Israeli economy. So the program to give Israel, it's not just tourism, or it's not just people who are just finished the military and they want to travel and just visit and see LA or see New York. It's not just about that. It's about big part of Israel's economy and Israel's strength. And when you look into, obviously there is tourism, and also there is a huge connection between family members. Every other Israeli have a cousin or an uncle or a brother, such as myself, for example, who lives in the United States. I lived there for so many years. So those connections, the ability to go back and forth. You mentioned the number, at least 500,000 Israelis, if I got the numbers right, visited just 2022. And those years are down in the numbers because of still, getting out of the corona, but it's supposed to be picked up, and traveling is huge with the United States. So I think and you do have family members or people who are in business, whether you are Israeli right-wing, left-wing, or an Israeli Arab. 21% of the Israel society are mostly Muslims, Arabs, and they do have their own connections and family members and business they do. So the tech industry supposedly has to be also in the Arab sector. It's not just a Jewish thing. It's in the entire Israeli population. Everybody here has a startup, right? Every other person has a startup, and what they do is that they travel all the time. So I think it's across the board. It's a big prize for this government. If this government, the current government, will be the one who will get the visa waiver program into effect, it's going to be a huge, huge achievement of them, political achievement, I would suppose.
Great. Great, thanks for clarifying. I'll take a couple of these questions here and pass it, and then I think I'm going to go around and give you all a chance to say something. Final remark is, just keeping an eye on the clock here. 1 second, I can't open the questions, sorry. Does the visa waiver program apply only to Israeli passports? How does it impact those with Jerusalem travel documents or from the territories? Anybody handle on that? Bob, presumably.
The particulars of what the documentation would look like are still being worked out. It will probably be Israeli passport holders.
Another one probably also for you by the looks of things. If Israel stands up to all the technical systems and makes necessary commitments on reciprocity, is there a period during which that has to be tested before it's granted, or is the end of, like the cutoff, that's the end of September, it happens the next day if everything was there? What's the timeline on this once we get to that point?
So yes, we need to have tests presumably sometime late summer. We have a very, very definitive timeline that would be required. So we need to test the systems. As we've said repeatedly, it's a security system. So we're presumably, they must meet all requirements prior to designation. So, and also test them, because with the security system, you want to make sure it works. So we can't just go on and September 30th, turn the system on and say, oh, hope it works on October 1st. So we will do extensive testing that's built into the projections that we work with the Israeli government. And that's one of the things that makes this very, very challenging, is that when people hear September 30th, that's the finish line. We have a lot of interim steps that need to happen before that.
If I can just add, not to make things even more complicated, but after or alongside what Robert just explained, there's a statutory requirement for a national security determination, as I understand it, that the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Homeland Security, and the White House will have to make. That's a lot less complicated. Technically, it's a determination, it's a decision. But again, compliance can't go up to September 29th and then somehow, and I think the government of Israel understands that. At least I hope they do.
They do, and we all have our bureaucracies. So we're dealing with a couple of bureaucracies in Department of State and Department of Homeland Security, which are not small. So we have to build in the time to make sure that, my boss and the Secretary of State are comfortable with everything we've seen. So it takes some time, and that is built into the timelines, the aggressive timelines.
Thanks all. I'm going to do a round, last one, so people can have their say or forever hold their peace. Scott, anything final?
Just to say, it's, we published this study, Ruth and I, and for anyone interested, the Atlantic Council's circulating it. There are a lot of complexities, but looking ahead towards September 30th, it's really about focus, I think, and having the Israeli government focus, having key stakeholder communities. I hadn't thought about Israeli high tech until Tal raised it. I don't think they're going to, the Association of High-Tech Businesses is going to put up a billboard on the Ayalon freeway next month, visa waiver in Hebrew, let's get it done. But getting all stakeholder communities to be thinking and focused on it, because politics ultimately is responsive, and Israeli politics has an enormous amount of weight on its shoulders right now, collectively, the judicial issue, political divisiveness. So in a way, I think, even though, as I said at the very beginning, just to go back to my opening comments, the control in terms of fulfilling the requirements is entirely in the hands of the Israeli government. Key stakeholder communities shouldn't just be sitting on the sidelines, either watching with interest, or occasionally cheering. I think they should be making their voices here, so that focus, so that the officials who really have to do the hard work, and there's a lot of work, Robert laid out quite a long list, as did Stephanie, that they can get it done. There is enough time. I don't think Ambassador Nides would have released the video, and the two departments wouldn't have released the statements they released last Monday if there wasn't enough time and there wasn't a finish line in sight. Thank you.
Thank you. I will actually, in terms of the seriousness of getting this done, we did approach an Israeli official working on this thing to ask if he wanted to join the panel. And I guess the encouraging response is, we're busy working right now. We don't want to do this. This isn't the time to take conversations. We have things to do. So, that was a good sign. Bob, over to you.
When I was in Israel last week discussing the program, I was told that they are living, sleeping, and eating visa waiver program. So that would be in line with what we saw. I just want to mention a couple things that was discussed about what this means to countries and what it would mean to the Israelis. when we got Poland and Croatia in, I actually was, when I was working in the European Union, I ran into a woman who was one of the staffers in the EU, and she was Polish. And she was, once Poland got in 2019, she was recounting how she was crying that they got into the visa waiver program. And much the same way with Croatia. And I have a feeling the groundswell will be very similar if Israel gets in. And it's a very, very important thing for the people-to-people ties, the security. And, I really hope that we can, over the next 10 months, which this is, if not my number one priority, among my top three, to get Israel into this program, because it is something that's good for Israel, good for the Department of Homeland Security, and good for the US. So we're very hopeful that we will be able to meet all the requirements and get this done.
Just out of curiosity, I'm not sure it's something you know the answer to. I mean, it seems like just walking the streets in Israel, every second you sort of trip over somebody who actually has an American passport. How many people are we talking about here in this pool of people who need these visas to get in? Do you have any idea what the number of it we're talking about?
I don't. I know it's a significant number. And part of the issue that was mentioned previously with the high-tech communities and things along those lines are, if people can plan, they can get a visa. But for people who won't be able to plan and need to get a visa, and the appointments are however weeks or months, that allows a flexibility for that. And also, it's there's a significant cost. So it's the numbers, it's the people, it's the costs.
Thanks, Al.
Yeah, I mean, I've been DC correspondent many years ago. I've been covering the Israeli request to have a visa waiver program for so many years. So yeah, I'm happy to be able to cover this from the Israeli perspective at the end of the year. Every time, there was a minister in Israel talking about it, reporters said, yeah, come on. I mean, we've been hearing this for 20 years. I mean, I remember myself bashing at Ayelet Shaked. Why are you coming up with this now? I mean, we've been hearing this since 2000 and whatever. Let's hope that this time it feels more real to me as an Israeli citizen, and it's going to be good process for the Israeli people, I guess. So. You are
Shalom, you're on mute.
muted.
I'm ready for the last word before mine, I guess.
So what we're seeing is the result of the commitment of the Biden administration, Secretary Mayorkas and his whole team, to try to do everything that they can to help Israel fulfill the requirements that 40 of the United States' closest allies have already met. I think we're at a point now where there is a process of education that I have to say Scott's and Ruth's report really does help everyone with. It's always the case when new people come into government that there's a period of education and adjustment where people learn that things they thought worked one way, in fact, work another way when they actually take on the responsibility of governing. I have to say I've been encouraged by the support Prime Minister Netanyahu has given Israel's admission to the visa waiver program. There are still some tough decisions the Israeli government is going to have to take, but I think there's enough popular support among Israelis of all kinds. The benefits would flow to both Israel's citizens as well as US citizens of all kinds. And I think the increase of closer ties between all the peoples of Israel, all of the peoples of the United States, is one that this effort, I think, will bear fruit that will benefit the people of both countries. So I'm optimistic that we will get there. I'm also realistic about the amount of hard work that's going to be required, especially on the Israeli side, to get these requirements in place and operational before September 30th.
Thanks, Chitu. I think we're going to close it out. Presumably, we will all have greater clarity in the months ahead as Israel works to meet these benchmarks. What's fairly clear is that both the US and Israeli governments are committed to making this succeed. If we can quote Ambassador Knights from that video that Scott referenced, it's good for Israelis, it's good for all Americans. Let's get this done. I think everybody here pretty much agrees with that statement. On behalf of the Atlantic Council, I want to thank everybody, Scott, Bob, Tal, Tom, also Dan and Stephanie for joining us and participating today. I want to thank our Middle East team and our events team for helping set it up. Hope everyone will join us for future events, and I hope you all have a great day. I think we're clear.